Good day, Junior Tickies. I'm Mrs. Brimacombe. We're going to look now at Manufacturing Activity 4. Question 4.1, Concepts. Match the descriptions below by choosing the correct answer from the list provided. Write only the answer next to the question number in your answer book. So question 4.1.1, salaries paid to workers involved in production is direct labor cost. Number 2, the value of raw materials the raw materials used in the factory production is direct labor cost. Commission paid to sales staff will form part of your selling and distribution cost. Number 4, water and electricity paid for the office will be administration cost. Number 5, indirect materials used in the factory forms part of your factory overhead cost. Again, make sure that you study the theory. You will always get theory questions that you will need to complete. And this is the easy marks to get. 4.2, ledger accounts and cost calculations. Simply Shake manufacturers. You are provided with information relating to Simply Shake manufacturers for the year ended 31 August 2022. The factory manufactures shake bottles. Required, calculate the raw material stock on 31 August 2021. So here they've just asked you to calculate the raw materials, not asking you to complete the ledger accounts. Number 2, use the table provided on your answer book to calculate the factory overhead cost. And number 3, complete the following general ledger accounts: asset disposal account and the work in process stock account. So take note how asset disposal, a topic which you've done right in the beginning of the year, how it's incorporated into all the different topics throughout. So starting with question 4.1.1, the raw material stock on 31 August 2022. When it's asked in this way, just to calculate it, it's up to you how you want to show your calculations. If you want to do a T account, that is 100% correct. So I prefer doing a T account. So I'm going to open up the raw material stock account and I'm going to start with the opening balance, which was given to me, 27,500. If we're looking at the raw materials, they said raw materials purchased, cash and credit, 926,800. Damaged raw materials returned to the supplier means that we will need to subtract that, 15,200. Carriage on purchases of raw materials was for 48,740. This must be added to our stock, added to our cost. Then it says materials stolen during a break-in. The insurance company paid out 25,000. 80% of the total stock was lost. This means we need to calculate what was the actual cost of the stock which we lost. What was the 100%? Which means we're going to take 25,000, which the insurance company is going to pay us out. We're going to say times 100 divided by 80 to find the original cost of the stock which we've lost because it was stolen. Then he says, raw materials issued to the factory during the year, 932,890. This means it must be subtracted. Now we can calculate the balance at the end. Take the debit side, if you're doing a T account, minus the credit side, equals 23,700. Now, just for the purpose of understanding, I've included details, but you don't need to show any details. You just need to show what is it that I need to add, what is it that I need to subtract in order to find a balance at the end. Calculate your factory overhead cost, which means we need to look at balances and the transactions for the year ended 31 August 2021. Again, why am I looking at the balances? Factory indirect material cost. This is one that learners often forget. Whatever was left over at the end of last year must be added to our expense this year whatever was left over at the end of this year must be subtracted because it doesn't form part of my expense for this year. Looking at the transactions now, we're going to start with our factory foreman. They provided 62,500. And what do we need to add? UIF contributions is 1% of the basic salaries or wages, which means the factory foreman, 625, must be added to that. Indirect materials, we start with the balance from end of last year must be added to our expense plus the factory indirect materials purchased. They're specifically talking about factory overhead, so we're going to add it. And what must be subtracted? The factory indirect material stock at the end of this year. Maintenance, remember advertising, do not include it. It forms part of your selling and distribution cost. Factory maintenance in brackets, 46,985. Rent expense in brackets because we need to look at how did we distribute those expenses. Bad debts, do not include this into your factory overhead cost. This will go to your selling and distribution cost. Water and electricity in administration department, 6,710 in brackets. Sundry expenses, factory department, 45,600. Looking at our rent expense now, it says that the rent for August 2022 is still outstanding. The rent decreased with 5% from 1 January 2022. Rent is apportioned according to the floor space occupied by each department. Floor space occupied is as follows: 500 in the factory, 350 in the sales department, 150 in the office department. So step number 1, first do the adjustment. So 1 month is still outstanding. 1 month should be added. But now we can't take the rent expense 106,500 and divide it by 11 to get the monthly. Why? Because the rent decreased with 5% from the 1st of January. If our accounting period ends 31 August 2022, it means it starts the 1st of September 2021. The rent decreased with 5% from 1 January 2022. So for 4 months, it was at 100%, and then for 7 months, it was at 95%, 100 minus 5. Don't just add it. You're so used to just always the percentage increase. In this case, it decreased. So there's different ways in which we can get to exactly the same answer. My method, which I prefer, for 4 months, it was at 100%. For 7 months, it was at 95%. I want to know what was it per month. So we take the total rent times 95 divided by 1,065. If you add those two together, it equals 1,065. This will provide me with the amount which I'm looking for. What was the rent after the decrease? This means 9,500 must be added. Then we can divide it into the floor space, 500 divided by 1,000. If you add all of that together, it equals 1,000. Take note of the different ways this is given to you from the one activity to another which we've completed. Water and electricity are distributed, administration 10%, sales department 25%, the balance applies to the factory. So what is that balance? Your total water and electricity is equal to 100%. Minus 10 minus 25 means that is the amount which will go to your factory for water and electricity. Now if you look at water and electricity, they sit in the administration department specifically. This means I cannot take 6,710 times 65 divided by 100. We have to say times 65 divided by 10 because the administration department equals 10%. And that equals the total water and electricity which should go to your factory department. So again, be careful with these type of calculations. Sundry expenses must be divided between the factory and the sales department in the ratio 3:1. The bookkeeper incorrectly calculated it in the ratio 3:2. Correct the error. So now we need to do corrections. This means that if I'm looking at the sundry expenses, it's 45,600 divided by 3 times 5, because I want to know now what was the total sundry expenses for this accounting period. What was our expense? Then I'm going to say 76,000 times 3 divided by 4. This is what it was supposed to be. Remember, it said it should be divided in the ratio 3:1, but the bookkeeper incorrectly calculated it in the ratio 3:2. So take note of my approach. So my factory overhead cost should be 57,000 for sundry expenses. It was calculated at 45,600. So the difference, it was actually understated by 11,400. This is what I'm looking for. What was the total factory overhead cost? And this is why my approach was to find what was the expense for this year and then take this 76,000 and work it out in the ratio that it should have been. Now, if we're looking at factory equipment, we need to calculate depreciation. Depreciation is calculated on the old, the new, plus that which we've sold. So what we're going to do now, before we complete the factory overhead cost, we are going to first look at the general ledger account in the asset disposal account. So it says that old equipment was traded in for new equipment on 28 February 2022. The new equipment cost 100,000. Simply Shake manufacturers still owed 81,000 after the equipment was traded in. The cost of the old equipment was 80,000 and the accumulated depreciation was 60,000 on the 1st of September 2021, which is the beginning of the accounting period. Depreciation is calculated at 15% on cost. So what is happening here? We need to calculate depreciation on the new, the old, plus that which we've sold. And they've asked us to do the asset disposal account. Our accounting period ends 31 August 2022, which means it starts the 1st of September 2021. The old equipment was traded in for new equipment on 28 February 2022, which means depreciation must be calculated on that which we sold for 6 months, on the new for 6 months. And then the old is always equal to 12 months. So if we start with the new equipment costs 100,000. 100,000 times 15% times 6 divided by 12 means my depreciation on the new is 7,500. If we're looking at asset disposal now, the old equipment cost 80,000. Step number 1 in asset disposal, take out the cost out of equipment to the asset disposal account. Remember your steps. Step number 2, update the depreciation from the beginning of the accounting period until the day that we've sold it. Step number 3, record the selling price. Step number 4, calculate if we made a profit or a loss. So to calculate now the depreciation on what we've sold, to update it, we need to use the cost. So 80,000 times 15% times 6 divided by 12. That equals my depreciation on the asset which we've disposed of, from the beginning of the accounting period until the day that we sold it. So my total accumulated depreciation is 66,000. To find out the selling price, because that's our next step, they said to us that the new cost 100,000. We still owed 81,000, which means that if I take 100,000 minus 81, because we traded this in, it means that our selling price was 19,000. Details, creditors control, because we traded it in 19,000. So you needed to find out the selling price by completing a T account. We still owed 81,000, the new cost 100,000, so you could find the selling price. Now we can calculate if we made a profit or a loss on the sale of the asset. Cost minus accumulate equals the book value. If I balance this account, you would see that the credit side is more than the debit side. It means that we made a profit of 5,000. Cost minus accumulate equals 14,000. 14,000 minus 19,000 equals 5,000. We sold it for more than the book value, which means we made a profit. This is a profit, it's not an expense, so it will not appear as any of the cost accounts. If we now look at the factory overhead cost and we look at our total depreciation, it's the new, what we've sold, plus the old, that equals my total depreciation. Now we can calculate our total factory overhead cost. Please take note again of my approach. I first completed the asset disposal account and looked at all the calculations before I completed 4.1.2. Now the only ledger account left for us to complete is the work in process stock account. We start with the opening balances. They provided the balance in the beginning, 17,600. Again, this account will always consist out of, on the debit side, direct material cost plus direct labor cost plus factory overhead cost. On the credit side, we would always have the balance carried down. And what do we calculate? The cost of finished goods stock account, or the cost of finished goods, which is taken to the finished goods stock account. They provided the balance in the beginning and they provided the balance at the end. Next, we need to look at what is it that we can solve. If you look at the raw materials, they said to us, raw materials issued to the factory during the year was 932,890. That which was issued is equal to your direct material cost. Then we need to see if we can solve direct labor cost. What have they told us? For direct labor cost, it says production wages, ? And then they said UIF contributions, 1% of basic salaries and wages. And they provided to us, the factory workers in the production, 5,700. So if we want to find out our total production wages, take the UIF, the 1%, and say 5,700 times 100 divided by 1. Then we're going to add the UIF contribution, and that is my total direct labor cost. Then we solved the total factory overhead cost. That was calculated. Again, make sure that you use your answer, which you've calculated correctly. Now we're left with one item that we need to solve. That will become now the balancing figure. Take the debit side minus the credit side. That equals the finished goods stock. Question 4.3, unit cost calculations. Safety First. Safety First is a small business that manufactures bicycle helmets. The business is owned by partners Justin Moore and Jabu Sitole. Required, what is the difference between fixed cost and variable cost? Number 2, should the business be satisfied with the number of helmets that were produced and sold during this financial year? Explain. Quote relevant figures in your answer. And then number 3, the partners want to make an additional profit of 350,000. How many helmets must they make to achieve the target of 350,000? So take note the different ways in which these questions can be asked. If we look at what is the difference between fixed cost and variable cost, fixed cost stays the same irrelevant of the number of units produced, whereas if we're looking at variable cost, the cost change depending on the number of units produced. Question 2, should the business be satisfied with the number of helmets that were produced and sold during the financial year? Quote figures. So can you see I don't have last year's figures to compare now to. So what we're looking at, we're just looking at the number of units produced and sold, and we're comparing it to the break-even point to see, are we breaking even, are we making a profit, or are we actually making a loss? So if I look at by comparing the two, the owners should be satisfied because the break-even point is less than the number of units produced and sold. So quote your figures. They produced and sold 12,480 helmets, which is 2,847 helmets above the break-even point. The business is making a profit. Now, if you want to calculate that profit, take the contribution per unit times the number of units more than the break-even point. To get the contribution per unit, 350 minus the variable cost. Number 3, the partners want to make a profit of 550,000. How many helmets must they achieve? How many helmets must they make to achieve the target of 550,000? So to find this, we're going to look at the profit which they want to make is 550,000, and we're going to divide it by the contribution per unit. To find the contribution per unit, you have to take the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit. So 550,000 divided by 192 means that they need to make 2,864.6 units. And if you round it up, that equals 2,865 units. This is the additional units that they want to make. Just a correction there. The question was incorrect. I've realized that now. The partners want to make an additional profit of 350,000. How many helmets must they make to achieve the target of 350,000? So we take the additional profit that we want to make, 350,000, divided by the contribution per unit, which is the selling price minus the variable cost, 192. That equals 1,822.91, and if we round it up, 1,823 units. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to look at activity 5. I want to leave you with this. It is true that every effort is not converted into success, but it is equally true that success does not come without effort. Have a wonderful day.